Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We are so excited that you have joined us on our mission for girls of color. Let me start by extending my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to Malika Sada Sar and Google for hosting this event. I'd also like to thank our keynote speaker, Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Catherine Lehman, and our wonderful panelists, Kimberly Williams-Crenshaw, Rocio Inclán, Danielle Mosley, our very own CEO of YWCA New York City, Sunil Mansukani, and Lindsay Rosenthal. I'd also like to extend my special thanks to our Vice President of Advocacy and Public Policy, Catherine Bean, who led the charge in putting together this excellent event, as well as our Director of Mission Impact, Dante Hilliard, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today because he's representing us at another event, but he's responsible for overseeing our Stand Against Racism program. I'd like to acknowledge our board member, Emily Tynes, who joined us today, and also our staff from across the United States who's here. We are so excited that you're all here, and each of you. You know, today's convening is part of our Stand Against Racism, which is an annual campaign by YWCA to build community among individuals like each of you who work for racial justice, and also to raise awareness about the negative impact of institutional and structural racism in our communities and our lives. You know, this campaign goes to the very heart of what we at YWCA work on every day as one of the major tenets of our mission, which is the elimination of racism. And each year, our Stand Against Racism campaign takes a different shape, molded by the needs we see around us. And for this year, many news reports and really tragic videos, like the one recently released from San Antonio, showing a school police officer using unbelievably and shockingly excessive force on a 12-year-old Latina, that made it very clear to us that we need to focus our efforts on the unique intersectional challenges facing girls of color. And you know, we all know that all too often, girls of color are overlooked when policymakers address issues of gender and racial inequity. For example, statistics make it clear that Black girls face disproportionate challenges in schools and in the justice system. And Latina and Native girls do not trail far behind them. Yet so much of the conversation about criminalization and the school to prison pipeline centers on boys of color. And that's why we're here, to elevate the critical concerns of girls of color, and more importantly, to identify policy solutions to address them. But you know what? The deeper we delve into this topic, it becomes more and more clear that the world may not actually be ready for this intentional act on our part and on the part of many others to focus positive attention and resources on this marginalized group. Let me give you an example to show you what I mean. It was something interesting and troubling that happened as a result of what we thought was a seemingly innocuous Facebook post that we put out, YWCA USA, on February 23rd, 2016, calling for girls and young women of color to submit blogs about their life experiences for our Stand Against Racism campaign. You know, we never anticipated the response it would generate. As of today, there have been more than 600 comments and over 3,000 shares on this Facebook post alone, well exceeding our normal engagement rate, even when compared to other hard-hitting issues that we've covered, like the roles of guns and domestic violence homicides, racial profiling, immigration reform, and military sexual assault. Now, while many of the replies have been positive, applauding YWCA for supporting girls of color and elevating the issues they uniquely experience, more than a few, however, interpreted this ask as racist and discriminatory against white girls. The level of discomfort around simply providing a platform for young women and girls of color to discuss their experiences tells us a whole lot about the delicate state of race and race relations in the United States. Let me just share a couple of the comments. One said, and I quote, "Young white girls, I mean, white is still a color, right? Oh, wait, they don't matter, I forgot," end quote. Another said, and I quote, "Give me a break. Racism is on all sides, not just women and children of color. You are the problem," end quote. And here's another, and I quote, "What about white girls? We're hated on too. That is just racist singling out just girls of color." You know, it's been said that equity feels like oppression to those who are privileged. And it feels truer than ever in this case. And while I hate to even admit it, the truth of the matter is that this type of backlash comes as no surprise to me, both as the CEO of YWCA USA, an organization focused on eliminating racism and empowering women, and as an African American woman. Racial inequity continues to be such a divisive and pervasive issue in the United States that even focusing a positive and enlightened discussion on the needs of girls of color who are clearly disenfranchised by structural and institutional racism can become controversial. But let me be clear about something. That's not going to stop us. It really only emboldens us to keep pushing for desperately needed change. And that's why today's briefing is so very important. We must create spaces where we can talk frankly about the unique challenges and obstacles faced by girls of color. And we must also work to identify solutions that can change the troubling course too many young girls are already on. And many of us in this room are examples of how girls' tenacity can turn to women's leadership when it's given the opportunity to flourish. I mean, I was only 2 years old when I first announced to my parents that I wanted to be a doctor. And I was armed with my dad's Wall Street Journal, the confidence of a toddler, and my Pampers. And I thought I was ready to take charge. But even though the first team that I attempted to lead, which was my parents, my older sisters, they weren't exactly what I would call cooperative. They did support and protect me. But most importantly, they led by example while helping me to develop and foster my own leadership potential. And I rode that confidence all the way through medical school. At YWCA, we want to see every girl of color, every girl with her own confidence, her own unique strengths and potential, accessing the same opportunities that many of us had to build the life that she wants. But we know that it takes more than good parents, concerned teachers, and after-school programming, although these things are very important. At YWCA, we know that systems must change in order to ensure girls of color get what they need and have an opportunity to achieve their dreams. And at YWCA, we combine exceptional programming and grassroots community service with legislative advocacy to provide immediate support while fighting for systemic change. And we've been working on this for over 150 years with a hope that one day we will achieve the mission of our organization to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And thankfully, we're not alone in our thinking. Just look at the person sitting to the right and to the left of you in this room. We are all passionate about creating a better life and a brighter future for girls of color. And many of you know that later this morning, the newly formed Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls is holding their launch event. And I'm so thankful to Representatives Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Robin Kelly, and Yvette D. Clark for making Black women and girls a priority on the Hill. Like each of you, I am looking forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists who will share their research and brilliant analysis of the issues many young girls of color face. But let me simply say this. Far too often, girls of color who are facing economic and educational disadvantage are over-disciplined and criminalized, when what they really need is for someone to notice them, for someone to realize that they do matter, for someone to take the time to see that they are hurting and acting out. What they really need is love, care, empathy, services, and support, not re-traumatization. The negative experiences and unfortunate realities faced by many girls of color have the potential to disrupt the educational path and lives of far too many of our young people and their families, creating a vicious cycle of inequity that can persist throughout their lifetimes. That's why we must talk about and do something about the challenges young girls of color face. That's why we must do so much more to prepare our girls of color to succeed in school, to succeed in their careers, and to succeed in life so that they will ultimately become empowered women. So our goal for today is not just to lay out the challenges and obstacles, but rather it's for us to leave with an action plan, a list of things that each of us can do in the short and long term to make sure that every girl is on a level playing field. We must use our knowledge, our skills, our resources, our power, our passion, and all the grit we can muster to do whatever we can do individually and collectively to make sure that the girls inside and outside of this room can have an opportunity to orbit the earth like Mae Jemison, or sit on the US Supreme Court like Sonia Sotomayor, or head a Fortune 500 corporation like Ursula Burns, be a barrier-shattering dancer in the American Ballet Theater like Misty Copeland, or just simply to have an equal opportunity to achieve whatever her goals are in her life. Our nation's collective silence and inaction represents quiet consensus and acceptance, particularly for those who perpetrate racism and sexism, and for those who feel that the lives of girls and young women of color don't matter, and also to the young girls whose lives, bright futures, and dreams are deferred by our inaction. That's why we're so happy that you are here on a mission with us. This issue is huge, and we need all hands on deck to resolve it. The institutional and structural racism and sexism that our girls and young women of color must grapple with on a daily basis are real barriers to opportunity. And only with our collective action as a national movement to stand up for girls of color can we begin to dismantle these unequal structures and create a more equitable and just world for girls and young women of color. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is now my esteemed pleasure to welcome Malika Saada-Sar, Google's Senior Counsel on Civil and Human Rights, and our moderator for today's panel, to the stage. I look forward to a very robust conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Hi, everybody. It's such a blessing and joy to see all of you here. Many of you I have had the distinct honor of working with, and truly having you here and having us engage this issue graces Google. So welcome. Before joining Google, I had the privilege of working on a paper, a report, called the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline. And Lindsay Rosenthal was also one of the authors of this report. And what we said in this report is that we have talked about the school to prison pipeline, which is real, and we need to talk about. But there's another pipeline that must be surfaced, and that is the girls' pipeline. And really, the black and brown girls' pipeline, which is the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. Because what we established was that sexual violence was a leading predictor for girls' interaction and involvement in the juvenile justice system. And one of the worst manifestations of how girls are relegated into the juvenile justice system because of their experience of being sexually abused is how we incarcerate girls who are being bought and sold, how we take girls who are being trafficked for sex, girls under the age of 18, and we criminalize them. Every year, 1,000 children are arrested for prostitution, even though most of them are not even of the age to consent to sex. We arrest 1,000 children for prostitution, and 65% of them are African American. When we did this report, and when I was heading up the No Such Thing campaign, that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, only victims and survivors of child rape, I met with a girl who had been bought and sold and arrested. And she told me that she was out there at the age of 14, being sold to 10 different men a night. And on one night, law enforcement saw her when she was under the control of her buyer and went to her, threw her into the police car, let her buyer go, and said to her, "You dirty black bitch." And that was her experience of criminalization. Not of being seen as a child, not being seen as a victim of repeated serial rape, but instead named as wrong, named as dirty, named as culpable. This is what we have to address, that too often when Black and brown girls are sexually abused, the protected status of child, the protected status of victim of violence is denied. Who is allowed to be the child and who is not? Who is allowed to be the victim and who is denied that? And when we talk about our Black and brown girls, that is a repeated trope. The denial of their suffering, and instead, worse, their criminalization. And I think that we also have to be very honest that this has historical roots, that there are ways that the Black and brown female body has been diminished as Jezebel, as over-sexualized, as unrapeable. And that is too much at play when we talk about the suffering and what our girls have endured. You know, Ta-Nehisi Coates has made this powerful point that there is a historical and repeated way in which the Black body is destroyed in this country. But at the intersection of race and gender, the Black female body, the brown female body, has been rendered communal property. So today, at Google, we are here to give voice to that. Against the backdrop of too much silence and too much marginalization, we are here to speak about the lives of our Black and brown girls, to understand what they are experiencing, to landscape the solutions and the opportunities. We are here to unapologetically talk about them, to center the experiences, the sufferings, and the fierce brilliance of our Black and brown girls. And so with that, I am so deeply honored to invite to the stage our panel for today. We will have with us the one and only Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, Executive Director and co-founder of African American Policy Forum, Professor of Law at Columbia and UCLA, and really the pioneer and the one who named intersectionality. I think it's always important to be able to name our pioneers. Rocio Inclán, Director of Human and Civil Rights Department of the National Education Association. Dr. Danielle Moss-Lee, CEO of YWCA of New York City and New York City Commissioner for Gender Equity. Lindsay Rosenthal, Senior Program Associate and Gender Justice Fellow of the Vera Institute for Justice. And not at all to be forgotten, Sunil Mansukhani, who is our wonderful presence here and principal of the Raven Group and former colleague of mine. Please come to the stage. I'm hooked up. Am I good? Okay. So we want to begin first by landscaping the issue that we are addressing from the different systems in which we see our girls of color interacting, to landscape what they struggle with from those different spaces. And so I want to ask Kimberly if you can begin for us.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank the YWCA, Google, Malika for making this a banner day. I mean, it's been years that many of us, including folks on this panel, have been trying to elevate the questions around the intersectional erasure of girls of color. And it's almost mythical that on the day that it actually happens, it's happening across Washington, D.C. So there are like 3 events today on women and girls of color. So let's just hope that means that there's a lot of energy, and this isn't the only energy in the room. So I've been working around questions of intersectionality for about 20 years, both through research and through the African American Policy Forum, an organization that was formed in the aftermath of the Million Man March, specifically to lift up the ways that gender plays out in the context of communities of color, the ways that racism and patriarchy intersect to create particular kinds of obstacles. And on top of that, the way those obstacles are often marginalized within our own community discourses. So among those who should be allies are those who actually don't see the particular ways that women and girls of color are subjected to a whole range of exclusions. That work has become more prominently focused on the school to prison pipeline over the intervening years, in part because there has been so much uptake around the question about how schools are gateways to the punishment industry. That conversation has been an important one, a vital one, one that forces us to take account of the unintended, sometimes consequences of policies that are sometimes designed to do things that they cannot do. So the school to prison pipeline created and generated a focus on some of the ways that zero tolerance policies, some of the ways that reforming schools in the frame of trying to make them more safe actually made them less safe, actually led more youth into juvenile involvement with the juvenile justice system. What was missing, though, in that analysis was the way that girls are impacted by the school to prison pipeline. So typically, girls of color fell between the cracks. There's a crack in respect to the way that the school to prison pipeline focused on boys, and to the extent that there was any conversation about girls in school, it usually didn't focus on the girls who were in the schools with the zero tolerance policies. So if you look at agendas around school to prison pipeline, most of those interventions and most of the way that people conceived of the problem focused on boys. If you looked at things that dealt with girls in education, they dealt with questions that were real, but generally not questions having to do with criminalization. not questions having to do with punishment. Instead, questions having to do with whether girls are exposed to STEM programs, for example, or whether girls who are early parents have the kind of support they need. This is all important, but it didn't get at the root of what was happening to so many girls of color. So we decided to look into that in a report called Black Girls Matter, pushed out over-policed and underprotected. We started looking and asking, well, what actually is happening with respect to this push-out problem? And we found some astonishing facts. So number one, while it is absolutely clear that across the board, African American students are disproportionately suspended from school, and this is across the board, African American males are 3 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. But for girls, for Black girls, that disproportionality is 6 times the rate of white girls, right? So underneath the focus on boys was actually a significant racial disparity that no one really talked about, in part because we don't tend to talk about race as something that happens between women and girls. We see race as usually something between communities or something between men and other men, but not something between girls. When we looked even more closely, we looked at New York and we looked at Boston, and we found that the rate of suspension was 10 times and 11 times the suspension rate for white girls in those 2 cities alone. When we started looking at expulsion, it was worse. It was so bad we couldn't even calculate the ratio. So those of you who do a little bit of math or data know that you need to have at least one person who's subject to something to calculate a ratio. So we had to imagine a white girl who had done something significant enough to warrant expulsion in order to come up with the ratio for New York. The ratio for New York, if you can imagine who this white girl is 53 to 1. We're talking huge disparities that simply were completely erased. So we decided to start talking to girls, and I'll just share with you 1 or 2 statements just to give you a sense of the nature of the problem. Why did they think they were subject to disproportionate suspension? What did they think was happening? The girls told us, number one, zero tolerance environments don't make them safer. In fact, it discourages them from coming to school. Some of them get to the metal detectors and just think, this feels like harassment today. I can't do it. So it dissuades many of them from coming to school. Zero tolerance policies don't apply generally to sexual harassment. So one girl who ended up being suspended several times and ultimately expelled drew her whole history of expulsion back to a moment where she got suspended when a boy punched her in the face and she defended herself, and they both were suspended. They also tell stories about how their various needs aren't addressed, and so they know that because the schools are so focused on discipline, the only way that they can get to the office for someone to talk to them is for them to act out. So girls would say they showed face, they gave face, in order to actually go to the office in order to tell somebody what's happened to them. So these are all of the consequences of what happens when we have a vision of the problem that is non-intersectional, that doesn't include women and girls, and that exacerbates the problem by directing interventions in a way that reinforces the idea that their problems are insignificant. So I'll end with a couple of comments that I heard from people who are advisors and teachers. They tell us that because there's such a little focus on girls who are experiencing trauma in school, on achievement gaps, and on other risk factors that girls face, that many times even girls who are invested in school and who are really trying to stay attached get the message that their performance doesn't really matter to anybody. And they tell us that all girls, all children want to be acknowledged for something. So if they don't get acknowledged for performance, if they don't get acknowledged for their effort, if the message is, we expect this of you, it's your brothers that we're most concerned about, it has the unintended consequence of telling them you have to seek recognition in other arenas. And for adolescent girls, those other arenas are not the arenas that necessarily lead to well-being and long-term security. So this is more or less the point of entry, to think about how schools as a site of discrimination, trauma, and the entryway to lifelong vulnerability to incarceration can be changed if we have a view, if we have a framework that allows us to see how race shapes the experiences of girls and how gender shapes the experiences of children of color.
Good morning, everyone. Muy buenos días. The education experiences of girls, I want to thank you first for having me here, and thank you to you, Malika, and YWCA and my colleagues for being here. I want to, as we talk about this subject, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the education experiences of girls of color are as varied and diverse as the group itself, right? As a Latina woman, as a mother of a 10-year-old daughter, Latina girl, as an educator in Arizona, where most of my students were Latinos, I am most closely and intimately aware of the Latina experience and the Latina experiences in schools. Yes, we are going to talk about the data, we're going to talk about the impact of different systems as they impact institutional racism. But what I want to take us back to the individual first. So as a Latina woman, yes, I was we lived in our family went through a lot of sacrifice to receive education in the United States. In fact, we lived in Mexico and we crossed the border daily to attend schools in the United States. That required a lot of sacrifice from every member of our family, sacrifice that was worthwhile for our family. And this is what we still know about schools and education, is that it still is the place of opportunity for all races: Latino, Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, and Pacific Islander. We invested a lot in schools. We believed in schools and these same systems that we're going to talk about that need to be changed, that need to be impacted by who is in our schools and who, not only who's teaching, but who's attending and who's part of that system that impacts that school system. You've heard many experiences from different races. As a Latina, I worked really hard in school and I had all honors classes, and I was still advised to not attend college because that's probably not going to work out for my large family, and because we were not financially stable, that wouldn't be a good idea. I was in tears when my daughter came home and shared that she was not allowed to be the lawyer in the school play because as a Latino girl, it'd be better if she were the mom. And that's going to be better. As a teacher of students in Arizona, I am intimately aware of the broken immigration system and the impact it has on our Latina girls, Asian Pacific Islander girls as well. So I know we're going to discuss systems and how the systems are interrelated, education, health, justice, housing, media, and how porous these systems are, how they impact one another. What I want to talk to you about is the system that I represent, the teachers within that system that I work with, and that I see every day. And I will tell you that I have not to this day met one single teacher who entered the teaching profession wanting to do something bad, wanting to hurt girls of any color, who entered the teaching profession not wanting to be of help to their students. I have not met one single teacher who wasn't that caring adult Dara talked about, that person who looks at students with love, And that's important for us to know. At the NEA, we know those stories. It's these teachers who know the names of the students behind the data, the names of the students behind the impact of the data, that I think where we have a lot of opportunity. At NEA, we're directly focusing on institutional racism and the school-to-prison pipeline as part of that system that's racist in education. And we're focusing on three things. We're focusing on awareness, education, and advocacy. Because it's important for all of our teachers, all of our education school personnel to be aware of all of these things that are impacting our girls of color. It's important that they become aware of the role they play in that system that's institutionally racist. It's also important that once they become aware, that they become educated around what is it that I can do. We all know that the teaching population does not represent the ethnicity of our student population. That's fine. Once you become aware, how are you going to get educated? And I don't care if you call it diversity training, cultural competence, whatever you want to call it, it is about becoming educated of what your personal biases is, what your hidden biases might be, and how that's impacting every student in that classroom. And then we at the NEA are an organization of 3 million members. We want to move beyond awareness, education, to activism and advocacy. We can change the world. We believe that. We can change that inside the educational system and outside the educational system. So as a teacher, when Patricia or Adilene or Ivan would come to say, Maestra, mi mamá va a estar bien. Teacher, is my mom going to be okay? Are my parents going to be okay? It's not enough that I was aware what the question was behind the question. I knew that their parents were undocumented. I knew that it was a question around, am I going to go home to see my loved ones, the people most precious to me? It's beyond that. It's that I had to become educated on what would be the best ways to educate these Latina girls. What are the best programs? What do I need to know about myself and how I'm impacting my classroom and the system as a whole? But that was not enough. How do I then become an advocate and activate others around changing our system of comprehensive and moving towards comprehensive immigration reform? And I will go back to something that Dara says. I absolutely believe that it's about love. It is about seeing the faces of the students, knowing their names, and caring enough to do something about the system that has disadvantaged them solely based on race. Thank you.
So thank you to our national CEO, Dara Richardson-Heron, for having me here. I head the YWCA of the City of New York, and I took that on about 4 years ago, but it was a long road to get to that seat. I started my career as a middle school teacher in the Bronx in New York City, and that was back in 1991, right? So I'm aging myself a little bit. And I started my first girls' club at that time for my students in 1991 after a young lady who was on a lunchtime suspension. I figured out that she wanted to be suspended at lunchtime so that she could sit with me and eat together, right? Because that meant you didn't go to the cafeteria, you just got all of my attention. And she said, you know, at the time her mother was reconciling with a boyfriend who the family was aware had sexually abused her. And she had a lot of anger and rage around that relationship. And so I said, well, as we kind of started this girls club, we started meeting after school, taking them to conferences and outings on Saturdays, and really just understanding the need to create separate space. As a teacher, I can say that I think a lot of that over-discipline of Black and brown girls really comes from the notion of what a girl should be, what a girl should look like, And girls who don't fit that mold, who don't fit that all-American, not black, not brown ideal, are always seen as out of sorts. And this really kind of goes to the highest level. When I was leading another organization and kind of deciding what I wanted to do next, as part of my fundraising responsibilities, I found myself in an Upper East Side club with a very wealthy New York male. And he wanted me to know how familiar he was with the issues facing the black community. So you can already see that this probably was not going to go well. And he says to me, you know what the problem with Black America is? He actually wrote a paper and put it on his website, but I'm not going to throw no shade. He says, the problem with Black America, this is 2012, he's probably estimated net worth at $500 million. He gives to a lot of black causes, Latino causes in New York. The problem is that 14-year-old black girls don't know how to keep their legs closed.
Oh, yeah. Of course.
So that's the context in which we move in philanthropy, in political circles. The idea that every failing has everything to do with the black female body when it comes to our communities. And so for that reason, when I had the opportunity to lead an organization whose mission was eliminating racism and empowering women, something that I had been living my whole life, right? I didn't need special permission. But to actually have a platform to have those conversations and keep my job, right? Because it's real out here. That was obviously the thing that kind of drew me to the YWCA of the City of New York. We serve about 2,500 young people and young women in New York City. And the thing I love about the YWCA in its current iteration is, we used to have a really nice building at 610 Lexington Avenue on the Upper East Side, and people think that that's who we are, right? But today's YWCA, the City of New York, is Coney Island, it's East New York, it's Brownsville, it's Harlem. It's all the communities where there is pervasive need, incredible geographic isolation. So it's very hard. A lot of folks want to do work in Harlem and certain sections of Brooklyn because they're easily accessible by public transportation, right? You can get all your volunteers to kind of come to certain communities. But there are neighborhoods in New York, despite our public transportation system, that are incredibly isolated. And they're pockets of poverty without a lot of access to educational enrichment, specialized programs, college access. And so that's the work that we're trying to do. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Again, I want to echo the thank yous for having and convening this conversation. And to Malika, we're in such an exciting moment right now. My name's Lindsay Rosenthal. I'm a Senior Program Associate and Gender Justice Fellow at the Vera Institute, where I lead a project that focuses on ending girls' incarceration through public health approaches. And I wanted to start with sharing a story about how I first came to understand health as an entry point to creating safety and justice for girls. So one of my first jobs out of college, I was very inappropriately hired at the age of 23 to supervise the night shift of a locked juvenile justice facility for adolescent girls. It was me and 30 girls with no training, and it was my job 8 hours every day to try to keep them safe. And there was one girl, Daniela, that's not her name, but she was a troublemaker from the start. From day one, the administration wanted her out. And by troublemaker, I mean she was constantly on suicide watch, and when she wasn't on suicide watch, she was causing harm to others or herself, right? But she was in the throes of dealing with very severe trauma, had grown up in the foster care system. I still don't know everything that had happened in her life. But I tried everything from sitting and talking to giving her magazines to bribing her with ice cream. Nothing worked. I couldn't get through. And then one day we were in the kitchen and it was time for chores, and she was cleaning the table, spraying it with cleaner, and there was a fan on. And some of the cleaner sprayed up into her eyes. So I did what I think any human being would do in that situation, and I rushed her over to the sink and I helped her flush out her eyes. And I'm panicking because I'm like, do we need to take her to the emergency room? Who's going to watch the rest of the girls? If I need to go in the ambulance, all of this. And she's just standing there staring at me, blinking the water out of her eyes. And she doesn't seem to be in pain anymore, but she's not saying anything and just completely bewildered. And she said, "Miss, you cared that my eyes were burning." And I was like, yeah, you know. And from that day forward, I won't say we had a deep connection, but she respected me and we got along because I cared that her eyes were burning. And over the last 10 years, as I've tried to make sense of all the things that were going wrong in that facility that I see as just one massive human rights violation, I come back to that moment because it terrifies me that a girl could grow up in a family, in a community, in schools, where she's adopted the worldview that it's possible that someone's not going to care that she has chemical burns in her eyes. And that's the level of isolation and lack of physical safety that informs the self-protection and self-preservation that we're seeing from girls. So when Malika and I wrote the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline report, we described racist and sexist policies that criminalize victims of abuse by arresting child rape victims as prostitutes, or by using law enforcement as a behavioral management tool for schools or for the foster care system. But in a very big picture way, what's happening with the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline is criminalizing the health impacts of violence. So if you take even a cursory look at the literature on child trauma, you will see that the same behaviors that lead girls into the juvenile justice system are exactly the symptoms of child abuse. And I would say that locking a girl up and isolating her and putting her in a situation where she doesn't feel safe as a response to child sexual abuse is the equivalent of taking someone with high blood pressure and clogged arteries and prescribing them a diet of 12 cheeseburgers a day. It may take some time, but none of us needs to be an MD to understand what the ultimate consequence of that is going to be. And unfortunately, when you look at one of the only studies we have on long-term outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system that breaks things down by race, gender, and ethnicity, you'll see that boys exiting the juvenile justice system are 3 times more likely than youth in the general population to die by the age of 25. For girls, that figure is 5 times more likely. And for Latina girls, that figure is 9 times more likely. And these are preventable causes that are often directly connected to their histories of abuse. So we need to hold the education system to the fire. We need to hold the juvenile justice system accountable. But I think too often we leave out a healthcare system that should be responsible for identifying and responding to childhood trauma much earlier on. And so today I'll be talking about some ways that we can bring healthcare to the table.
Hi again, I'm Sunil Mansakani, a principal at the Raven Group. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to the YWCA and to Google for having this important conversation. I'm here today on behalf of Futures Without Violence, which is a social justice nonprofit that more than 30 years has spearheaded groundbreaking education and training programs, spearheaded national policy development, and engage in a whole host of actions designed to reduce violence and trauma against women, children, around the world. In terms of my own personal background, I think for me it started in the late 90s in the Justice Department doing education work where school discipline even then was an issue. And so what we were trying to do was, again, figure out how you gauge these disparities. And step number 1 was actually getting the data. Even in the federal government, getting that data was a challenge, and so we hadn't heard about the words intersectionality yet. So we were just looking for, any racial disparities, and then the question is, okay, we found the disparities. How are we going to go to court and prove that this is discrimination? It was a very difficult challenge. Fast forward about 10 years, I entered the United States Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights at the beginning of the Obama administration, and we took great efforts to try to increase transparency around the data so that folks like advocates and policymakers can actually do the intersectional analysis to see what is happening with black girls as it relates to the discipline system. And so I think we moved the ball forward with respect to data. Where I was still struggling, however, is what are the solutions? And I think just in the last 5 years or so, I would say, there has been much greater work, good work going on, and what some of the solutions are that I think we'll hopefully talk about in the Q&A part of the program. But what I want to spend my time in the opening is talking about the effect that trauma has on educational attainment. You're going to hear more about this, again, in the Q&A part, but it's really sort of striking what happens when kids have been exposed to trauma and how that affects how they do in school. The research is pretty clear that students who have been exposed to violence and trauma have lower grade point averages, they have more negative remarks in their cumulative records, and more reported absences from schools than other students who have not been exposed to trauma. Those who have experienced 2 or more ACEs experiences, adverse childhood experiences, are more than 2.5 more times likely to be retained in school than those students who have not been, and that includes accounting for demographic characteristics as well as health factors. It's also been found that trauma can negatively impact your ability to concentrate, which obviously if you're having difficulty concentrating, that leads to some of the issues about acting out in school and also just being able to follow what goes on in the classroom. And it's been documented time and time again that chronic stress literally changes the brain composition in kids. Literally changes the brain composition. And again, it causes trouble with memory, creativity, among a host of other things. And so I think part of the good news is that those brain changes are not permanent, and we are learning more in science about how to reverse some of those changes. But literally, you take MRI scans of children's brains before and after, and you see a difference. The problem, I think, that we are facing, at least in the education sector, is that not nearly enough professionals know about the impact of trauma on learning. And so step number 1 is to raise that level of education. Just to give one example, the White House last year had a school discipline conference, and anyone who's done more than 10 minutes of work on school discipline knows how trauma could play into school disciplinary incidents. So the presenter asked, by a show of hands, there were 180 school administrators from around the country in the room, by a show of hands, how many people have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? There are about 4 or 5 people in that room of educators who had heard of that. And I think that speaks volumes about where we need to go as a movement, as a bunch of advocates. As stated by Dr. Bob Ross, who's the head of the California Endowment, he said that childhood trauma is the #1 public health problem in America. The #1 public health problem in America, and most people don't know much about this. He's also said that this is a problem that's literally hiding in plain sight. We are seeing it in our kids, and yet we've got to figure out what to do next. And for those of you who have now understood the impacts of trauma, it doesn't take a big leap to figure out that if we are addressing that, we help address some of the ills in our educational system, such as the bullying and harassment that particularly affects girls of color, such as school discipline, which you've heard a little bit about already and you're going to hear more about, such as closing achievement gaps, which is so important to so many in our society, such as increasing graduation rates. All of that, I'm not saying there's any one solution to what ails our educational system, but I think we can all agree that if you reduce children's exposure to violence and the effects of trauma, that will be a great step forward. Again, I think our fundamental challenge is how do we raise awareness of the issue, and then secondly, how do we move from awareness to action?
So I'm going to go deeper around this issue of trauma and violence. And, you know, I had started out my career as a teacher, and I was teaching kids from East Palo Alto, which before Silicon Valley came around, East Palo Alto was the murder capital of the world. And all of my female students hated me. I tried to reach out to them. I tried to do a girls group, book club, and all I got in response was anger, dismissiveness, and extreme detachment. And so I thought it was because I wasn't a good teacher, even though for some reason the boys did think I was a good teacher. I just thought that there was something wrong with me. 10 years later, I was in a girls' detention facility, and I saw the same difference. The boys in detention on the other side of the campus, they were they were hurt, but they were engaged in conversation with us. The girls, it was the same anger and detachment. And I was with a group of people, so I couldn't internalize it as all me being bad and not enough. And I asked the counselor, tell me what I'm seeing, because I saw this when I was a teacher. Tell me what I'm seeing with the girls. And she looked at me and she said, don't you realize that all of these girls were sexually abused, and abused by people they were told loved them or were there to take care of them? And so I bring this up to say, how do we, in talking about violence and trauma, gender it and race it? Because doesn't it look different in the experiences of our girls of color? And how do we recognize that? How can we talk about that from these different systems?
Well, I'll jump in and talk about another, I guess we can call it system. And that is our own community system of denial, right? The historically understandable, but notwithstanding that problematic practice of not elevating the extent to which there is sexual abuse and trauma in our homes and in our communities. I'll start with a bigger picture and come down to our children. I think the consequences of our inability to speak to this have been dramatically represented. I know many of you probably saw Confirmation a couple of weeks ago. The inability to acknowledge that as women in the workforce, Black women have had to deal with sexual harassment since we arrived on these shores. And I say sexual harassment, advisedly. We're talking about significant and severe forms of sexual abuse, yet that hasn't been part of our understanding about what racism looks like, nor has it been part of our understanding about what solidarity has to be. Fast forward to Confirmation, partly because we don't have this understanding or internal conversation about sexual harassment, many people were able to see that as simply a white woman's issue, not recognizing that Black women were at the forefront of defining sexual harassment, and not realizing that Black women can be victims of sexual harassment racially encoded from other men of color. So one of our problems is that led to the unfortunate consequence that we're living through today, right? Now, we extend that into our families and to our children. When we don't have an ability to say that embodying the interests of all of us, being in solidarity with all of us, requires us to address all the ways that our children are put at risk. We don't have the ability to say that. That means there's a huge level of vulnerability that's happening to our girls that we can't see. And when we can't see, we can't raise awareness. And when we can't raise awareness, we can't create the interventions. So it's a parallel system of denial that actually creates greater vulnerability inside the systems. And the responsibility has to be both inside education, but also inside our communities, in the everyday practices of denial or marginalization of our girls and our women that are experiencing high levels of sexual abuse and trauma.
And if you all can each speak to that more of how the trauma is expressed differently, right? I mean, we have a kind of gender neutral, race neutral conversation when we say trauma in kids, but from a policy perspective, how do we recognize, right? How do we contemplate the very distinct ways in our schools, in our juvenile justice system, that girls and girls of color express trauma in a distinct way?
I'll go really briefly and then turn it over. But one of the things that, and you mentioned just in the way you described the story, which is sometimes people are withdrawn. And if you're a teacher with 25 kids in the class, you're gonna, your attention is gonna be the folks who are, raising a little bit of a ruckus. And the kids who are withdrawn often get ignored. And so I think that when we're talking about training and what to look for, it's not just the kids who quote unquote are acting out, or the kids who are, don't seem engaged somehow, but yet, they're doing okay. They're not, you know, you got other problems to deal with. And I think that's the thing we have to train people on, is sort of what are the signs of trauma, and then obviously what are you going to do about it? Because again, not every kid who is withdrawn has, you know, experienced a particular type of trauma, but I think it is that in of itself could be one of the flags to be looking for.
I think what resonated in your story is, you know, you came in, you wanted to do good, you wanted to help the children. It wasn't until a professional advised you, well, don't you see it? This is what they've been through. A lot of the issues that we face as educators is there are very few professionals we can go to. There are very few. I can almost imagine that your teacher preparation program did not say, look for the signs in girls. They might be experiencing this type of trauma or this type of trauma, and it's different if it's a girl or if it's a boy, and it's different if it's a certain ethnicity or a certain socioeconomic background. No one is preparing, our educators are not prepared for that type of, for being able to address these issues. And when they are able to see them, it's important that we don't have enough counselors in the schools. We don't have enough, even those counselors are not informed enough about the new data or the new ways to address these issues. And also, like, I always put myself in the place of that teacher. I would say, well, who do I call, right? What are the outside resources that can help me help these students? What is it that I don't know, and who can help me? And I think when we talk about policy solutions and we talk about, you know, what are the things that we need to put in place, having teachers inform the policy, having teachers share the story so that you can see the different connect points and what it looks like in the classroom and what's lacking in the day-to-day interactions that lead to this whole system.
I also want to point to anti-Blackness as a huge indicator of school violence among girls. I would say probably 95% of the fights that I've broken up had everything to do with anti-Blackness, colorism, hair texture, and how boys play a role in feeding that. And I'll give you an example. I took a group of young people to Senegal, and we were debriefing our day on Gorée Island. These kids were from Harlem, Washington Heights, and the Bronx. But somehow one of the boys decided he was going to rank the girls in our organization. And he started at the top with the lightest Latina, working his way down. And then some of the darker skinned girls didn't even make the list. So you can imagine, you know, all heck broke loose. But a lot of that inability to embrace each other is because we are constantly being questioned and rejected. And when are you more in tune with the way your body is changing, the way your outward beauty is received, than in adolescence, right? It's a vulnerable time for everybody. But if you are seen as the antithesis of everything that is good and well-behaved and cultured and light, which is why I think the natural hair movement has been so important and revolutionary, because it is really kind of a reclaiming of the self and also a retraining for parents. Like, I've had parents say, well, I don't want my kid to go outside at lunchtime because I don't want them to get too much sun, right? You know, and that's just the embodiment of, you know, perceived racial inferiority. And you know, this fight in Delaware with a young woman passing away. Like, I've been that mother, you know, I get a call at my job and my daughter's calling me from the bathroom to say she's scared to come out, right? I had to call the school office and get someone to find which bathroom she was in to escort her back to her class. And so it's, you know, it's real. You know, she was bullied and had her head slammed on a desk. And, you know, thankfully, I'm in a financial position to say this is not acceptable. And I took my child and we went someplace else. But I thought about all those mothers who don't have that as an option, who couldn't make a phone call or capitalize on a relationship that they had professionally to say that my daughter's in an unsafe space. So even students' reaction to you could have been informed by that visceral colorism that is just another manifestation of racism. And I would also say something about this whole ed reform movement and teacher accountability and how disempowered educators have become. And you have a lot of teachers who know this information but aren't in a position to act on it. I remember working in Bed-Stuy before it was, on the way to what it's becoming, right, in Brooklyn. And some of my students in the after-school program I worked in saying, Mr. So-and-so is like three miles ahead of where we are in terms of our understanding the content. And so, I'm an advocate. I went and spoke to Mr. So-and-so, and he said, have you ever seen the pacing calendar? So it doesn't matter if the kids got the material. They have actually scripted what a teacher can talk about on any given day. And if someone comes in to evaluate in a pop-up situation and you're not discussing what's on the pacing calendar because maybe your kids needed an extra day of long division, oh well, nobody cares, So I think there are a lot of systems at play. And then the other thing I would say is we don't pay attention to trauma in communities of color because we think we can take it, right? So we had a shooting. Actually, there was a kid stabbed in an elevator in Brownsville houses a couple of years ago, and the story made the paper. And when in certain communities, if there's an act of violence that affects kids from the school, immediately, counseling services will be available. My after-school kids at the Y had to take that elevator where their friend died on a daily basis to get home. No one in that community, who had influence was saying, do these kids need counseling? And what we're really acknowledging is that they can't take it. They weren't made for that. Their bodies weren't made for that. Their minds weren't made for that.
Did you want to add to this?
Sure. I mean, I just want to stress the importance of even asking, right? And not assuming that kids are okay. So Sunil mentioned the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And what that study found is that childhood trauma is not the exception to the rule, it's the norm. But we don't, and it has profound consequences for health much later in life, regardless of how you respond to it, right? Sunil talked about changing the DNA, changing your stress response at a very early age. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study measures, at a starting point, 10 different kinds of childhood trauma, which include things that people do to each other, like sexual violence, physical violence, but also things that systems do to people. So having a parent who's incarcerated at a young age has profound lifelong health consequences. And when children, what the study found is that when people get to a threshold of having 4 or more of these childhood adversities, they have far higher rates of the leading causes of death in this country, regardless of whether they smoked, drank, or did anything to cope with it that was negative, right? That's just, and it's not, by the time you got to 6 forms of childhood trauma or more, you could have a life expectancy of 20 years less, right? Which helps to explain some of what I described earlier for the early mortality rates of girls exiting the juvenile justice system. And we've had this research for years. The Adverse Childhood Experience study was done in the 90s, but still, as Sunil described, you walk into a school, you walked into a trauma conference. When I train medical providers, most of them still have not heard of this research. And it's a public health crisis, as we talked about today. And so when you ask about these things, you can engage in much more aggressive, you might have a stronger prescription even for dealing with things like asthma, so that you can help children overcome this. And usually what happens when people do use ACEs screening is that they'll score, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and it matters less what the trauma was than how much trauma you had. But Malika and I worked on the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, and I would say that the sexual abuse does not play by the rules of the ACEs framework. Any sexual abuse in a person's life has the same lifelong health consequences as having 4 or 5 different kinds of abuse. And so when you look at girls in the juvenile justice system, and you see that up to 80% of them have a history of sexual abuse. And not only that, but that's not telling the whole story, because it's usually not just one incident of sexual abuse, right? It's something that starts around 5 to 7 years old and then happens multiple times by the time they're even 12, right? The lifelong health consequences of that are significant, and we can't assume that we can see it. Girls are so used to protecting themselves that they hide this. Girls will come into the juvenile justice system with burns on their bodies and not tell anyone. They want to keep it to themselves. So I'll tell you a story about, we don't have any data on what girls' health needs look like when they enter the juvenile justice system. It's completely invisible. Everything's done on paper, and when girls leave, that file is usually just stored away and never looked at again. But there's an organization called the National Girls Health and Justice Institute, which developed the only validated health screening tool for girls. It's administered on an iPad, and it's creating the first data set that's ever existed on what girls' health needs look like when they enter the juvenile justice system. And it found that 25% of girls say that they've been sexually assaulted within 7 days of entering a juvenile justice facility. So not just ever in their life, but they're being arrested in the immediate aftermath of having been a victim of sexual abuse. And 40% of those girls had physical, vaginal, or anal injury that were consistent with sexual assault. And when you see that gap between 25% who say they were sexually abused and the 40% who actually have physical injuries to their body that would indicate sexual abuse, it's because we don't create the conditions of safety for girls to be able to say what's happened, and there's so much shame around it. So I went to go see this tool being used in LA County, and the staff were very excited to tell me about this girl who was a troublemaker, who wouldn't sit down, who was going to pick up new arrest charges in the facility for fighting with staff. And they happened to be implementing this health screening tool that week. And she had physical injuries to her genital area that made it so painful for her to sit down that she was going to refuse to sit down no matter what they said. And the staff said, but when we figured that out and we helped her, she completely changed. She was no longer a troublemaker. I was like, she didn't change. She was never a troublemaker. What changed was the way that you saw her. What changed was the need for her to protect herself from pain. Mm-hmm. What changed was that you created a moment of safety for her wherein she could say, I am hurting. That is the problem here, and nothing else. And so incidentally, we have no standards of health care. There's no mandatory standards of health care for youth and juvenile justice facilities. There's voluntary standards, but the last time there was an audit, only 53 of the over 5,000 facilities in the United States complied with standards of health care.
So we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to go to our audience. So I want each of you, quickly, 1 minute, to be able to say, in all of what you have landscaped, which is fraught and so full in terms of the work we owe our girls, what is the one policy fix that can begin to address the full scope of needs and interventions? The one policy fix that is not the panacea, but begins to, I think, break down. I mean, we all feel the heaviness in the room in terms of what our girls are enjoying. What is one policy fix that we must do and is part of a larger solution? Start with you, Kim.
Move resources that currently support school resource officers away from punishment and directly into providing services for identifying, treating, addressing the conditions of trauma that are impacting so many of our girls.
I would make a policy that ensures that educators are part of making policy that impacts educators, schools, and girls.
I would definitely expand access to mental health services.
in the schools.
in the schools?
I'm going to cheat. About 2 years ago, we brought together an interdisciplinary group of health, education, and justice experts to address how do we tackle childhood exposure to violence and trauma, and what are the policy solutions. So if I had one thing to say, I would say read the report that we did and issued last year that gives 30 pages of solutions of stuff that you as advocates and policymakers could undertake in your own jurisdiction to advocate with the federal government about things and steps you could to move the needle on.
So I would normally jump to standards of healthcare and enforcing the actual multiple rights that girls have to healthcare. The policy framework at the federal level is actually there for them to access these services. It's just that states and counties don't fulfill what they're entitled to through Medicaid and other benefits. But I think none of the standards matter unless we have a trained and professionalized workforce that's capable of identifying this. And there's actually a bill before Congress now that's called the Child Welfare Workforce Professionalization Act, and it would create regional hubs that train interdisciplinary teams of people with specialized training in childhood trauma from medical, education, and other sectors. And I don't know, that would completely solve the problem, but it's certainly a good start given the lack of knowledge that we've identified today.
Thank you. I want to turn it to the audience. We have time for 3 questions. Are there folks who have any questions? Go ahead.
Oh, you did read? Okay. Yeah.
Presentation. I thought I knew a lot, but there was a lot that I didn't know. But several of you held up reports during your presentations, and I want to know if they're online.
You want to go first?
Yes, ours are online at Amazon and also can be ordered from our website, www.aapf, for African American Policy Forum.org.
And the report I reference is on the Futures Without Violence website, www.futureswithoutviolence.org, and I have a bunch of hard copies outside.
And the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline report is available at Rights for Girls, the number, I believe, Malika, right? rightsforgirls.org, also the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Equality website.
I see you. Go ahead.
I want to say good morning and thank you for everyone on the panel. I know that we talked a lot about some of the actions in terms of policy, but I wanted to know in the interim, what can we do as a community or as an individual as I am, that brown or black girl? Like, how can we support one another, or maybe support is the answer? How can we make the changes? Because I've been that black girl in the bathroom and people wanting to cut my hair, or you're cute because you're a dark-skinned girl. Like, where can we start the process as an individual or a community in the interim of the policy?
I think, mentoring is key. You can do that through your civic organizations. You can do that through your church. You don't need permission. You don't need a curriculum. Lots of stuff out there on the internet. But more than that, bring your black self to the table and make yourself available. One of the things that a former student of mine said was that, middle-class black people, I didn't even know y'all existed, right? So we are having our own struggles and living our own lives and negotiating the institutions that we exist in, but it's important for people to see you as a possibility and to interact with you on a regular basis. So wherever I work, mentoring is always a part of how I function, just because I don't want to be talking about issues that I've risen so far above that I can't really speak to authentically.
I would add to that bearing witness to much of what we heard. We have been going around the country over the last 2 years having town halls for women and girls of color to speak to the realities behind the data that we've been sharing. And part of the objective is to build the public will to address these issues. So we can have all the data in the world, but if there isn't a mobilized, organized demand from the public, from the stakeholders, from the communities, from the families to address these issues, they're just going to sit on the shelves. So this is, frankly, an effort to provide a space where women and girls can tell these stories to people who should be responsible, to people who are opinion leaders, to people who are leaders, so that from here on out, they can never claim that they don't know. And so that the women and girls know that their lives matter. So we can say their lives matter, but unless we perform it, act as if it is in fact the case, that's just going to be a slogan. So people can participate by actually going to events like these and like those, bearing witness, carrying the stories forward, making sure that people are then made accountable for the things that they know. So it's going to have to come both from a grassroots set of demands and responsiveness from individuals and institutions that have the authority to address these issues.
And if I could proudly wear my Google hat for a second. You know, there's an expression, an Ethiopian expression, that the hunt is never told from the perspective of the lion. But what tech allows us to do, right? What social media and internet platforms allow us to do is tell the story of the lion. And we see that on the YouTube videos of the girl who's slammed to the ground by the resource officer, or the girl who's straddled, right, by the police officer, and the ways in which our digital selves can speak to our pride, our injustices, our power. And so I would urge for that as well, because that is the power of tech.
Can I just say one more thing? Like, don't be a hashtag, right? Don't let all the excitement and the thrill of today and all of these events, like, I want us to be doing this for girls 5 years from now and 10 years from now, because we're not going away, right? And these issues are not new. So, you know.
One last question?
Yes. Good morning. So first, I just want to say thank you for, I feel like it's been a very moving and fantastic discussion this morning. And, you know, thank you to all of you for participating. My question is more, I wanted to focus on, and I feel like this is a perfect lead up, to women of color and their portrayal in the media and in pop culture. And I feel like some of the sentiments about anti-Blackness, you know, Professor Crenshaw's mention of confirmation, I would just love to take the opportunity to take advantage of all these minds on this panel and just hear your thoughts as to the portrayal of women of color, how are we responsible for how we're being portrayed in the color, and even by outlets that are supposed to be targeted towards us, you know, and any possible disservices that come there. I thank you.
Only you can take that, Professor Crenshaw.
I was hoping you were going to say that. Wow. I mean, clearly that is a topic perhaps for next year's panel. But I do want to completely affirm the idea that one of the most significant arenas in which our fates are determined is the representational arena, both in terms of our absence. So we have this kind of crazy dialectic. On one hand, we're hyper visible in some narratives, right? So you want to know if you're in a police department in an urban community, all you have to do is go and cast a whole lot of women of color to be in that police department, because those are the women who have been arrested for prostitution. We know that's where Black women and Latinas show up. If you want to portray a situation of sort of high income or real success, you know that because of the total erasure of people of color, particularly women of color. If you want to portray relationships between women of color and men of color, that doesn't happen usually in mainstream kind of representations. So we know that where we're not showing up and where we are showing up often signals what we're supposed to say about it. You were saying earlier that women and girls of color, Black women in particular, at the end of almost every analysis that is not a structural analysis, is the problem of Black women in their bodies. Right? That's not just a Moynihan frame. Mm-hmm. That one you can see if you look around at various ways in which racial problems are framed nowadays. At the end of the day, it is really about these Black women and girls who cannot control their reproduction because of inherent characteristics that they have. So either you see that story in political narrative, or you see it in videos and you see it on television.
And philanthropy.
And in philanthropy.
And-
so we have a big fight on our hands, and some of that fight is with people who look like us.
And just
Next year is representations of the Black and brown female body. But I want to thank you for an amazing panel, and I want to end with lemonade.
Yes.
Yes. As one should.
Grandmother, the alchemist, you spun gold out of this hard life, she says, conjured beauty from the things left behind, found healing where it did not live, discovered the antidote in your own kitchen, broke the curse with your own two hands. You passed these instructions down to your daughter, who then passed them down to her daughter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing some of the heart-wrenching challenges and obstacles facing girls of color, but also providing concrete solutions and specific opportunities that we can all consider as a way to take part in improving the lives of girls of color. You know, I just want to take a point and mention a few positive things, because I like lemonade as well. And we also certainly want you to come back to other YWCA events. We don't want you to leave sad. So there's some good news about women and girls of color. I'll just briefly tell you a few data points from the White House Council on Women and Girls report. High school dropout rates are down by 16% for Black girls and down 30% for Hispanic girls. College enrollment is up for girls of color. From 2009 to 2012, college graduation rates from four-year institutions have increased. And according to a 2015 report by the Pew Charitable Trust, over the last 25 years, teen pregnancy rates have dropped by more than 50% for all girls of color. So that's some good news that we can think about. And you know, here's one of my favorite statistics about girls of color, which gives me tremendous hope and optimism. Research has shown that girls of colors actually want to be leaders. In fact, surveys have shown that girls of color are more likely to aspire to be leaders and rate themselves higher on the leadership skills as compared to their white counterparts. And so when we encourage our awesome girls of color, we are paving the way for them to walk in a long tradition of outstanding women who have fought for and achieved social change. Women like our next speaker, Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Catherine Lehman. President Obama nominated Assistant Secretary Lehman for her current role on June 10th, 2013, and she was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate on August 1st, 2013. And when you take just a brief glimpse of her background, it's crystal clear why. Immediately prior to joining the department, Assistant Secretary Lehman was Director of Impact Litigation at Public Counsel, the nation's largest pro bono law firm. And before that, she practiced for a decade at the ACLU of Southern California, ultimately as Assistant Legal Director. Earlier in her career, she was a teaching fellow and supervising attorney in the appellate litigation program at Georgetown University Law Center, after clerking for the Honorable William A. Norris on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She was labeled Attorney of the Year for Civil Rights by California Lawyer, and the Daily Journal listed her as one of the top 20 California lawyers under 40 in 2007, and as one of the state's top women litigators in 2010 and 2007. She's a graduate summa cum laude of Amherst, and received her JD from Yale Law. No question why she was unanimously confirmed. Please let me introduce to you Assistant Secretary Lehman. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're honored to have you.
Thank you for the embarrassing introduction. And it's really just a delight for me to get to be with all of you. This topic is very close to my heart for the obvious reason of being a woman of color, but also because it's Take Your Children to Work Day. I can't resist mentioning that my daughter Clay is with me, and as the mother of 2 girls of color, this topic is also very personal for me. So I'm grateful that we are all in this room together, and I hope that we are figuratively in this room together every day, even though it is only today that we are actually in the room together. This fight is a fight that is, as the panel before me mentioned, ongoing. And for all of us to be able to have hope, and for my 2 daughters to be able to grow up into the world that we want for them and for all children, we need to stay in the fight and to continue. So I want to tell you some of the things that we are doing in the Office for Civil Rights, and we are short on time, so I'm going to choose 2 memes to talk about, which are discipline and sexual harassment. But I want to make sure that you all know and hear that we are serious about our civil rights charge, and that the 600 staff I lead in 12 offices around the country understand that all of our girls have identity status across lots of dimensions that include ability, national origin, gender identity, among others. And we are aggressively enforcing our civil rights for all of our students, P-12 and in higher ed, across every dimension that would affect their lives. But to focus on discipline, I know that we are at Google, and I think that it's right to be familiar with the ugly reminders that we've recently had about the reality that school discipline practices that are inappropriate in schools are visited on our girls of color every bit as much as on our boys of color. The video last fall from South Carolina of a school resource officer throwing a girl across the room was the starkest reminder any of us could have needed that we don't want to see those practices in schools, but it's very far from alone. Another video from last January captured a school resource officer attacking 3 girls in a Baltimore school. Those girls are 11, 13, and 14, and the resource officer attacked them first with fists, then with a baton, and then pepper sprayed the 3 girls, even though 2 of them were physically restrained by other staff at the school. And the counsel for the girls has said that the precipitating event for that violence in school was that the girls walked past the police officer when the officer summoned them. So that level of aggression and violence has no place in any of our schools for any precipitating event, and certainly not for that one. Those videos are visual depictions of what we know to be true and what we have captured in data. Our data reflects that our black girls are more likely to be suspended or expelled from school than any other girls, and than most boys, with the exception of black boys and Latino boys. We know that nearly 1 in 5 girls of color with disabilities receives an out-of-school suspension, in comparison to just 6% of white girls with disabilities. And we know that American Indian and Alaska Native students are just 1% of our total student enrollment, but 7% of American Native and American Indian and Alaska Native girls are subjected to out-of-school suspensions. So our data tells us that we have a problem in our schools, and we need to look underneath that data to figure out what's happening and how we can change those kinds of disparities in schools. I want to share with you the exciting news that just last week we entered into a resolution agreement with the Oklahoma City School District, and that agreement addresses the use of school resource officers in schools. So I heard that concern from my friends on the last panel. I share that concern, and we are very excited about what the nearly 45,000 students in the Oklahoma City School District are going to be able to enjoy going forward. We got to that component in the resolution agreement because a mom let us know that she had been arrested when she came to school for a school meeting by a school resource officer who was at school. And on the one hand, police officers are police officers wherever they go. And so if someone is subject to arrest, that person is subject to arrest at school as well, which begs the question whether the school resource officer should be at school. Because we want to see our parents able to come to school and to have meetings and not worry about whether they will be arrested. We want our parents to be able to participate in their students' IEPs. We want our parents to be able to come to parent-teacher conferences. We want our parents to be active participants in school. And we absolutely do not want to be sending a message to our parents and to our students that school is not a safe place for you and that you are not welcome and that we will not expect you and your family to succeed. So I am really, really thrilled about that agreement. Hope that you all will read it, and I also hope that you all will use and access the data that I was sharing with you. It's available at ocrdata.ed.gov. We use that data for our enforcement work and to review it, but I've been really excited about the ways that our communities have used that data also to be able to advocate for better and more appropriate school discipline, among other factors in their schools. And so I hope that you will share it. I want to turn to sexual harassment also and say that also, contrary to stereotype, like with school discipline, sexual harassment knows no racial boundaries. We know from the best available data that 33.5% of multiracial women have been raped in this country, as have 27% of American Indian and Alaska Native women, compared to 15% of Latinas, 22% of black women, and 19% of white women. So the reality is that one is too many. I strongly hold that view, and we should not rest secure in the notion that this is one category of women's problem as distinct from a problem that we need to be addressing across every category. In addition, the best available data related to our HBCU campuses is that nearly 15% of women interviewed on these campuses report having experienced an attempted or completed sexual assault before entering college. And I emphasize that, the before entering college, because I want to tell you a story about K-12, but also because I think that there is too much public consciousness that is focused on sexual violence as if it occurs when our students turn 18, as if our teenagers are not, and our children are not also potentially subject to sexual violence and needing our protection. So let me tell you one story from a California school district that we investigated because there had been a very notorious report of a gang rape on campus when a young woman was coming home from her prom and was gang raped at school for multiple hours. We hoped that that was an aberration. When we investigated, we learned about 2 other rapes in the same district that year, and including a middle school. When we talked to school staff, they confirmed what the students told us at these schools, and the students said that there were whole swaths of campus that they didn't want to walk on because they would be groped, because they were catcalled, because they were subject to repeat and ongoing sexual harassment. The administrators at the schools said, yes, that's true. They knew that. They understood it to be true, and they didn't take action to correct it because they said, well, that's their urban culture, which is not very coded. This is a heavily Latino district. That's our urban culture. So that's what we expect. There's a category of kids that we say that's okay, and in a middle school that you will be subject to harassment. Clay's older sister started middle school this year. I do not expect that for my daughter, and I do not expect that for anybody else's daughters. And I will tell you, it doesn't happen anymore in that district, happily. So part of our resolution agreement with that district is that they had to change their policies, they had to change their training for their staff, and they had to bring in the community's moms. Because when their staff had said to us, that's how it will be for these kids, we knew we needed to bring in the community to set expectations for what we want for our kids at school, the way we will treat our kids at school, and to make sure that there is nobody who misunderstands what Title IX demands and also what we want for our children in school. So I'm really excited about the ways that the community has been able to be part of reform in that district, and I am enormously distressed that in this century we were still hearing from our educators that this is acceptable and this is something that we will turn away from and look the other way from. So I say that to say, again, how grateful I am that we are all together and how far we have still to go. We see stories that are hair-raising across every dimension that we enforce in. We are deeply, deeply concerned about how far we are from the mountaintop. And so we need to be vigilant. We need to be in this conversation, and we need to stay in this conversation going forward. And I will end on that note, hoping that we will actually be in conversation now and that I can take some questions from you. And I really just want to say thank you for the ways that you are standing for our girls in schools. So I see a question already.
Hi, I'm Sue Klein from the Feminist Majority Foundation. And I was wondering, how do you envision the Title IX coordinators as helping to play a preventive role in all of this kind of harassment, assault, and many other types of sex discrimination?
So thank you. I mean, the Title IX coordinator has just a critical role. Every school is supposed to have a Title IX coordinator, and to make sure that there is somebody who is responsible for making sure that across every dimension that Title IX covers, which is pregnancy, sexual harassment, disability status, equal access to athletics, the full range of issues that our girls in school and our women in school can address, the Title IX coordinator is supposed to be able to make sure that he or she knows what's happening at schools, what the concerns are that are coming forward, to make sure that the policy is appropriate and that people who are participant in addressing issues as they come up have the training they need and have the skills they need to be able to address those issues for our students. And so we're really excited that there are Title IX coordinators. We want to remind our schools that they need to have Title IX coordinators. We put out a guidance package now a year ago this month to remind our schools of what the Title IX coordinator's job is, and we will, in the coming months, be able to post online the contact information for every Title IX coordinator in every school around the country, just to be able to elevate that issue too, because it's a really critical function in schools. Thank you.
All right. I don't know if there are many college students here, if any, but how would you recommend that we have increased access to these Title IX coordinators? Because as a student, I don't know how to get in contact with mine. I know a lot of people don't. And I had actually just watched a documentary called The Hunting Ground about sexual assault, and it deals a lot with Title IX. And they were saying no one knows if they have any access to these coordinators. So what would you recommend?
One, you should let me know and my office know where you go to school, so I can make sure that you and your peers know how to access your Title IX coordinator. Your school should have the information on the website and also in the student handbook and any place else that the school is talking about sexual harassment, equal access to athletics, among the other topics. And so the requirement is that the information about who the Title IX coordinator is needs to be open and notorious. As you painfully illustrate, it's not always, and that's something that we want to see changed. We see a range of noncompliance that begins with not having a Title IX coordinator, can sometimes extend to having one who doesn't know he or she is the Title IX coordinator. Sometimes to not having a Title IX coordinator who then has access to the information he or she needs for the school, to students not knowing who that person is and how to access that person to be able to get help. So, I'm dismayed by what you described. I'm not totally shocked by what you described. And one of the reasons that we are going to post the information online is to try to fill in the breach where sometimes schools are not as forthcoming as they should be about how to access that person. Thank you. There was somebody else who had a follow-up, I think. Okay.
Hi, my name is Russell Armstrong. I'm here on behalf of the Committee for Children, which does bullying prevention and child sexual abuse prevention. I'm glad that you brought up that sexual assault happens before college. Our concern is that it happens not only in high school and middle school, but even as early as elementary school.
That's right.
But we're worried that there's not enough research or evidence for the practitioners who are supposed to be helping students to cope with this and helping teachers learn practices for it. So what resources are there out there, and how can we push to have more prevention-based research and evidence to train people who work with these children every day about practices to help them avoid and how to protect them from child sexual assault and child sexual abuse?
You are so right that there's not enough research available and that we need more and better practices. The White House Task Force on Protecting Students from Sexual Assault collected the best available research, and this is now a year ago, but I think this is still current. There are 2 evidence-based practices that people believe work, that we have research to support, that apply to middle school students. So some part of the population we do have some information about. There's nothing that we have evidence support for college students, and nothing for elementary school students and high school students, which is to say 2 is not enough. and 0 is more than not enough for the other age groups. And so we need to be aggressively moving forward to try to get to a place where we have those tools and we can say this is what works and this is how we can use it. In the meantime, when we don't have it, we ought to be using the practices that we think about you ought to be trying. So we shouldn't be waiting till we get that research. And so I'm very, very grateful for the work that you're doing and for the conversation, the frank conversation that we're having here, which is that people can be subject to sexual violence at any age, and the contours of it can change, right? I mean, it's sometimes predatory behavior for our youngest children, and that's really scary too, in the sense that we have adults who are grooming kids to be subject to the worst kinds of abuses that we can imagine. Sometimes we are turning away from peer-to-peer sexual harassment that can begin very, very early for kids. We see truly ugly stories about what can happen to our children in school. And so if we want to live, we as a society want to live secure in a notion that our kids will go to school and will be safe, we should not be turning away from the kinds of things that can happen to them and instead thinking about what will it take to make sure that it doesn't happen. What we know for sure it will take is open conversation about what your school community is, what norms you expect, what's acceptable for your students, and making sure that people understand there is somebody to go to if you need to report something that makes you uncomfortable, that there are adults who will protect you and who will help to make sure that you are secure, and that we're trying to do the right thing. But we certainly don't tolerate on our school campus people's misuse of other people's bodies. So I think those are at least the first steps.
Hi, I'm a campus organizer and I work with students primarily in the South and on HBCU campuses. And I'm just wondering, does OCR issue any sort of guidance for what training Title IX coordinators should receive, not just in terms of like knowing the law, but like how you engage with a survivor when they come to bring a Title IX complaint? Because I just got back from a trip in Atlanta. One of my students was telling me about a forum that they had on sexual violence, and their Title IX coordinator said, well, if you're going to a boys' room at 11 p.m., you should know what to expect. So there's already sort of a barrier there of like, if I've been assaulted on campus, I can't even come to you to bring a complaint because you're just going to blame me and then not report it correctly. So I'm wondering, if you don't do that, are there any plans to incorporate that into the guidance packet and like what that currently looks like?
So first, I'm very sorry to hear what you just described. Again, I'm not surprised. The reality is that we have 7,000 colleges and universities, which means that we have people with a whole variety of skills and commitments who are filling the positions that we have, and we need to get to a place where we can be shocked and appalled, rather than just appalled by what you described. Our Title IX coordinator package that we put out last April does include the kinds of training that people should receive. What they do with that training is a different question, right? And so that's the next step. But it does include people need to receive training on these topics, and they need to be able to address these issues. The FAQs that we put out also about sexual violence covers the kinds of things that all school staff who will be involved need to know and need to be trained about. So we have said that, but checking that box doesn't then translate to student safety. And I think that's a very important point and something that we need to keep working on too.
Thanks. As a follow-up to that, and maybe this is more of a comment than a question, we're learning a lot more about the consequences of mandatory reporting practices and how those are really discouraging help-seeking behaviors, particularly among kids of color, LGBTQ youth. So I would just say that I would really encourage the Office of Civil Rights and all the folks doing this work to really think critically about, I know that Title IX coordinators have a responsibility to the entire campus, and there are campus-wide safety concerns in that context that make it a little bit unique, but to think really critically and thoughtfully about the consequences of mandatory reporting procedures when kids and young people disclose experiences of violence. It's certainly a problem in middle and elementary schools as well, but just the harm that can result in the silencing effect that can have when kids and youth know that there are mandatory reporting procedures in place.
So I think it's a fair comment and something that I wrestle with most days, and that we in the task force have spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to address, and certainly we in the Office for Civil Rights have as well. way that we have straddled the set of concerns related to that question is to say that schools can have confidential sources also, and they can advertise who those people are, and make sure that people know you can go, and these sources are places where you can say what you need to say, whether you think you're reporting or not. You can say what you need to say and then assess how and when you want to address that. And the goal for that is to respect the concerns that you identified and make sure that people have a safe space to work out what they need to work out. I will say, as a civil rights lawyer and the chief civil rights enforcer in schools for Title IX, that makes me very uncomfortable. And I am very supportive of the notion that each of us who has been through trauma needs to be able to own our own recovery. And that's my own experience, and I also think it's what I have learned and read and heard from very, very many survivors as well. And if we don't see that information reported, we cannot hold schools responsible for not acting. We can't ensure that schools can make their schools a safe place. It is a very easy way to avoid responsibility and to avoid liability to say we didn't know. And we can't be found to have known because we had confidential sources as well. So there are real concerns both ways about it in terms of actually making progress for survivors. Yeah. Great. I think our time is up, so I will say thank you very much, and it was lovely to be with you.
Thank you so very much, Catherine, for joining us here today and for the critical work that you are leading in the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. Your work and your attention to these issues sends such an important message to educators in America's classrooms and on our campuses, to policymakers, even as we speak, who are trying to implement the Every Student Succeeds Act, and perhaps most importantly, to every girl of color who feels the weight of school discipline disparities and disparities in our juvenile justice system. So thank you. Without a doubt, today has been about raising awareness of the systemic inequities that confront girls of color, about the ways in which structural and institutional racism impact their lives. But it's also about highlighting the policy solutions that we can put in place to change that narrative, about the concrete steps that we can take in the policy arena to open up doors of opportunity and to dismantle the systemic barriers that have created such disparities for girls of color. We need to be about the business of putting in their place laws, policies, and practices that will level the playing field for every young person. Because that's what we're really talking about, replacing laws, policies, and practices that have the intention or effect of treating people of color more harshly than whites, or of denying people of color access to the same opportunities and resources as whites, with ones that level the playing field for every young person. Sometimes those words, structural and institutional racism, those words in and of themselves can be barriers to our efforts. What do we mean by structural and institutional racism? What do you mean I'm a racist? How can we actually change something that is so big and so deeply embedded in our history? This is the challenge that we here at YWCA USA take on each and every day, finding concrete, meaningful ways to eliminate racism and empower women. And it's the challenge that we put before each of our incredible speakers today, to yes, describe the problem, but most importantly, to identify concrete, meaningful steps that can be taken in the policy arena to make change. Structural racism is embedded in the system itself and can be hard to identify until the disparate outcomes materialize. And we looked to this panel of experts to help us answer this question. Knowing what we know about the disparate outcomes that girls of color experience in education, justice, and health sectors, what can we do about it? And I think they knocked it out of the park. What a deep and vibrant conversation that we heard today. We heard Malika start us off talking about fierce brilliance. We need to make sure that girls of color are not solely defined by deficits and challenge, but by opportunities and fierce brilliance. Rocio talking about the girls and the experiences behind the data and the commitment that so many educators have to students that draw them into their profession in the first place and that give us a real opportunity to make change in classrooms and in school buildings. We heard Danielle talk about keeping it real, about how YWCA has been an important opportunity to speak about race and gender in a way where her job isn't on the line every day, because there are challenges and risks to speaking out about injustice that we all face, but that we need to take on. We heard Lindsay talk about how the worldview for too many girls is that no one would care if she had chemical burns in her eyes. That worldview is something that we need to take on, because there are preventable things that are happening to girls of color who experience trauma. And we heard Sunil share with us at the outset, giving us some concrete understanding about the ways that stress and trauma impact a child's ability to learn, about the incredible opportunity there is to provide so much more information to all kinds of health and education and justice system providers. We have a long way to go in making sure that all of the adults who play caring roles in the lives of children know what they need to know to take care of our girls of color. We are at such a moment of opportunity and hope. There is this critical mass of leadership and attention on these issues that we've been talking about this morning. As Kimberly referenced when we started, today alone, there are 3 major events going on within a mile of one another, all focused on girls and women of color. We hope that those of you who are able to will join the launch of the new Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls that started a short while ago over at the Library of Congress, and at the briefing hosted by Representative Bobby Scott. Professor Crenshaw has already left to go and speak at that one at 1 o'clock in the Rayburn building. It is a big day for attention on these issues and for making change. My optimism about the possibilities for change is also informed by very real economic and demographic realities. By 2020, more than half of our nation's children are expected to be part of a minority, race, or ethnic group, and our overall population will follow suit by 2044. We simply cannot afford as a nation to leave the structural and institutional barriers unaddressed. Even folks who have a different perspective about racial justice or social justice, who might not be comfortable in that frame, they have a stake in this conversation too, which means that we have a real opportunity to find new allies in this important work. A crisp focus on how our nation's laws and policies impact girls and women of color is a lens that's embedded in our history and in our mission at YWCA. In the weeks and months ahead, as we work on our policy and legislative agenda, you're going to hear us continuing to talk about these issues as we push for meaningful policy solutions in the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act and the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, and legislative efforts in the economic arena to bring forth paid sick leave, paid family and medical leave, and safe leave for survivors of domestic violence, and in our ongoing work to close loopholes that allow too many perpetrators of domestic violence to have access to guns. And on June 15th, when the White House convenes a summit on the United State of Women, the YWCA will be there to make sure that addressing the disparities experienced by girls of color are part of the agenda moving forward. We are on a mission for girls of color, and we thank you for joining us here today. We thank you in joining us in this important work, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the months and years ahead. Thank you.